2025 has been a fantastic year for indie games, which is obviously wonderful for us as players, but it turns out a bit of a pain when you're trying to pick out just 10 as the best of the year. Not one to be beaten though, I've gone ahead and done exactly that, and I want to get into it as quickly as possible. But before we start, we should probably cover what's been excluded. First of all, any games that are currently in early access aren't eligible. We're not counting them as released yet, so they'll have to wait until, presumably, 2026 if they want to be a game of the year. Also, there's kinda a lot of games these days, including some that would probably stand a good chance of making this list if I'd, got around to playing them. So apologies to the 19,000 or so games that dropped on Steam this year that I didn't manage to try out. Finally, when your whole thing is focusing on indies, and that is with regards to games, a really muddy term with no clear definition, it does cause a couple of problems. So, without that clear distinction, I will say that if your studio's core team is 30 odd people, then I'm counting your game as a AA title. So don't expect things like Expedition 33, Dispatch, and yes, even Hades 2, as good as they might be, to feature. There's probably a video in there somewhere about what indie should mean in 2026, but I digress. For now, that's the criteria we're going with. That's probably enough stipulations, so let's dive in with IndieLoupe's Top 10 Indies of 2025. Fighting off stiff competition from some more prominent titles which just missed out on our list, at number 10 we've got Heroes of the Seven Islands. This is just about the least known game on our list, and to be honest, I probably did it a little bit of a disservice in our original review of it, as there I heavily focused on the nostalgia-inducing similarities between it and the old Might and Magic games. That's something which developer Rap2H was certainly aiming for, but while I'll again repeat my heavy recommendation of it for fans of Might and Magic, it's a fantastic little CRPG in its own right. The game sees you take a party of therianthropic adventurers through a series of progressively harder islands, with the end goal of defeating the fleshless, soulless Furax the Indestructible. Unlike pretty much everything else on this list, the overarching story in Heroes of the Seven Islands is about as bare bones as its main antagonist, but it makes up for that by being a flat-out fun romp with excellent balance and progression. You can really feel your characters getting more powerful as the game goes on. With that said, it never becomes a grind, nor does it end too quickly. I think getting the length right on this sort of game is difficult, but it's executed perfectly here. It's also currently the only game on our list maintaining a 100% positive review rating on Steam, and one of only a handful that I plan on picking up again anytime soon. Definitely worth checking out, and definitely worth its place on this list. There were a few excellent games that were competing for the last couple of slots on this top 10 list, but the one that eventually snuck in alongside Heroes of the Seven Islands, after quite a lot of deliberation, was Skin Deep, a stealth immersive sim from Blendo Games. In it, you play as Nina Pasadena, security officer extraordinaire who is repeatedly and rudely being broken out of her cryosleep in order to deal with space pirates on the various cat-piloted spaceships that she finds herself employed on. If you're not familiar with it, it is as wonderfully ridiculous as it sounds, and if anything, my description there was underselling it. Despite being the ship's last and only line of defense, Nina's arsenal is usually composed of improvised weaponry. While she does occasionally get her hands on a gun or two, the tools of her trade are more often than not bars of soap, banana peels, and the trusty combination of a lighter and some deodorant. The missions aren't standalone, and across the game's dozen or so levels, players uncover a comedic conspiracy that leads to Nina facing off against the nefarious pirate queen who's been orchestrating the attacks on her ships. It's an ambitious title, and while if you're boring like me, its sense of humour can occasionally get a little grating, it's by and large a really fun game to play through. From the downright silly to the downright serious, at number 8 is The Darkest Files from Paint Bucket Games, which sees players take the role of Esther Katz, a young prosecutor in 1950s Germany looking into historic crimes from the tail end of the Second World War. The two pretty disturbing cases that you investigate in this game are based on real-life events, and see you encounter some particularly unsavoury characters. Obviously, a few of those are literal Nazis, so it's hardly surprising when I tell you that it has the most unlikable villains I've encountered this year. While you, the player, don't necessarily need to keep your cool and can freely swear at the bastards through your screen, Esther has to remain a little more composed, politely interviewing suspects while piecing together enough evidence to bring any guilty parties to justice. The fail state in this one is pretty damning. While you can obviously reload the game and give your Phoenix Wright-ish prosecution another go, if you don't adequately prove your points with the evidence you've combed through, you'll end up seeing people walk unpunished for their crimes. With the stakes that high, I want to refrain from saying that digging through that evidence is fun, but it's certainly stimulating and is laid out in a way that makes it incredibly satisfying when you finally crack each case. Its theme does feel unfortunately relevant at the moment. In earlier years it might have been an interesting look at a time we're long since detached from, but given its modern day connotations, this one is made that little bit more impactful. I'd say my top 7, though not necessarily their order, was pretty secure, and it starts with Inkle's Expelled. Inkle have been putting out excellent games for over a decade now, but when this one came out back in March, I said I thought it might be their best. 9 months on, and I'd stand by that. The game is set in Miss Mulligatawny's School for Promising Girls, which was also the game's working title, with players controlling Verity Amersham, a girl with some striking similarities to another Inkle protagonist, Veronica Villenzy from 2021's Overboard. Here in Expelled, you've been framed for a crime you can't have possibly committed, the defenestration of a fellow pupil, no less, but you were fast asleep when it happened. Players find themselves in a time loop where, with each attempt, they're trying to convince everyone of their innocence, Mulligatawny most of all, in order to avoid that eponymous expulsion. The game's time loop mechanic is handled about as well as I've seen in any game, framed neatly within Verity recounting the story to her father, with each restart coming about as she realises that her earlier telling wasn't quite how events had actually transpired. Through branching dialogues and different locations, which will have different characters in them depending on what time it is and what the player has previously done, players are given more information until the truth of the matter is uncovered. But even once you've figured out exactly what happened to your classmate, there's plenty of other mysteries to uncover within this school's ancient walls. It's an excellent narrative experience, and in my opinion, perhaps the most underappreciated game of this year. If you'd told me when I played Evil Trout's The Rue Trees Are Dead back in January that it wasn't going to make my top 5 games of the year, I don't think I'd have believed you. But again, that speaks to the quality of games that came out this year. I've mentioned that Return of the Obra Dinn might well be my favourite game of all time, so the Rue Trees appearing on this list is hardly a surprise, given the inspiration it took from Lucas Pope's 2018 title. With that said, I don't think you can just grab that deduction mechanic, shoehorn it into a game, and expect it to turn out as well as Rue Trees did. It's very much inspired by, rather than ripping off, serving as an excellent game in its own right, with unique and clever puzzles that the player feels oh so smart for solving. The part that truly stood out for me, though, was the somewhat understated second mystery, Rue Tree Mania. I've said before that a cursory glance makes it seem like a small addition to the game, rather than a fully fledged doubling up of content, and for me, that content is better. Not to take away from the original mystery, but here your task makes more sense, the mystery is that bit more interesting, and, most importantly, the puzzles tend harder, such that it's a real challenge which doesn't shy away from the fear of being too difficult. As with Obra Dinn, I'm sort of hoping that I can forget as much of it as possible. If I tried to replay it right now, I'd have recollection of characters and events that would ruin a lot of those puzzles, but I'm looking forward to the day that it's a distant enough memory that I can play it all over again. I said that I was surprised that Rue Trees was pushed out of my top 5. And perhaps even more surprising was the fact that it was done so by 2 games which both take around an hour to complete. The first of those is the most recent entry on our list, November's It Takes a War from solo dev Thomas McKinnon. Given that I spent most of my review slating it, me calling it a pretty poor Counter-Strike clone is still front and centre of the game's promotional materials. Anyone who switched that video off halfway through is probably wondering how on earth it's ended up at number 5 on this list. That's because It Takes a War is not what it seems on the surface, and instead hides within it a surprisingly heavy story. I was familiar with McKinnon's previous work, The Corridor, and the It Takes a War demo also made it clear that there was something altogether different going on here. But on the basis of those, I was expecting something surreal but relatively jovial, as opposed to anything that was going to hit me in the feels. We've already had The Darkest Files on this list, and there are a couple of other games coming up that are certainly laden with emotions. But It Takes a War was the one that ended up hitting closest to home for me personally, and covers a topic which I don't really think I've seen addressed before. There's 2 sides to this game's story, and if you've ever had a relatively tight group of friends you've played games with, you'll probably see yourself in one of those, perhaps even both at different times of your life or with different groups of people. It remains a very difficult game to talk about without blowing the concept, but one which I wholeheartedly recommend. There were a couple of games this year where I felt that putting out a review for them wasn't enough, and I was instead inspired to write a 35-minute plus video essay on them. The only one of those that's actually materialised so far was for the game that comes in at number 4 on our list, Many Nights a Whisper. There's evidently a lot I can say about this collaboration between Selkie Harbour and Deconstruct Team, even with its runtime being about the same length as It Takes a War's. The only reason both games aren't higher is probably on account of their length. Not that I think either should be any longer than they are, it's just that for better or worse I'd find it difficult to justify a 1-hour game as the year's best. In Many Nights a Whisper, you play as the Dreamer, a young woman who's spent most of her childhood preparing for a ceremony that's soon to take place. That ceremony involves shooting a fireball from a sling into a chalice very, very far away. Over the course of the playthrough, you listen to people's greatest desires and choose to accept them if you deem them worthy. You have one chance to make the shot during the ceremony. Do it, and the desires you've accepted come true. Fail, and they will never happen. The power of this game is in the various moral dilemmas it presents you with, and the lessons it teaches you about yourself and about acceptance. To get into all of that takes a long time, 37 minutes and 21 seconds by my reckoning, but if you want to save yourself listening to me for all of that time, it's also the least expensive game on this list. I can't think of a better way to spend $3, nor many better ways to spend an hour. There are a handful of typically old school genres that I really tend to not go in for. Things like FPSs, though I guess we've already got 1 or 2 of those on this list depending on how you look at things, point and clicks or any sort of 2D platformer aren't usually going to be of interest to me. So, when a certain Australian studio dropped their most recent game in the third quarter of this year, even if it looked promising, I didn't necessarily have the highest of expectations that it would be something I'd enjoy. But here it is at number 3 on our list. I am, of course, talking about The Drifter from Powerhoof. The Drifter is a point-and-click adventure which tells the story of a drifter who finds himself embroiled in a paranormal conspiracy when he is murdered and somehow doesn't die, instead reawakening a few moments before his death. This serves as the core premise. He doesn't even know why someone's tried to kill him, let alone what's causing his supernatural revivals. And investigating both of these things leads him deep into an ever-expanding rabbit hole. I've said before that this game has some of, if not the most, gorgeous pixel art I've seen, particularly when it comes to its animations, and that does a fantastic job of setting the scene throughout the game, along with its soundtrack, voice acting, and incredibly high level of polish. Its story is perhaps a little convoluted at times. I think it kind of has to be, given that premise, but it has a pace to it that makes it feel more like a thriller than what you would typically associate with a point-and-click. It was that pacing, along with some clever design choices, which made me call it a point-and-click for people who don't like them, though I'm sure fans of the genre would also be all over this one. For me, it's honestly a genre that would take something really special for me to enjoy it, and The Drifter certainly accomplished that. Given that this next game occupies the number 2 slot, it probably seems a little strange that it's the only one we didn't cover with a video or article. That's because it's the second game on this list that I wanted to write something a little more long form about. But almost a year after its release, I've not really found the words that I think do it justice. Citizen Sleeper 2, Starward Vector, is, perhaps even more than the game I've got at number 1, a title I would consider important. And look, as pretentious as I suppose I can get when it comes to video games, particularly when talking about them on this channel, I think it's an incredibly rare trait for a game to have. A huge part of that comes from how wonderful Gareth Damian Martin's writing is. If there's a better individual writer creating games at the moment, then I'm yet to encounter their work. In the Citizen Sleeper games, you play as a sleeper, an emulated human mind housed within an artificial body. The game's mechanics borrow heavily from tabletop RPGs. They sort of play out as if you're the only player at a table, with Martin's writing serving as your GM. You roll some dice, go on some adventures, and leave the game pondering some pretty huge questions, like what it means to be human. I was somewhat aware of Citizen Sleeper, but hadn't played the first game until just before I played Starward Vector, effectively experiencing them back to back. There is some debate, but for me it significantly surpasses its predecessor in almost every regard, which, given how good the first game is no small feat. There are some wonderful, elegant pieces of prose in both games, but for me, the, for want of a better word, regular writing, where you can see the subtle and sometimes not so subtle interactions between its characters, is where the real beauty of this series comes from. In many, many other years, this game would have been my game of the year, but for the game we're about to get onto. One quick thing before we do that though. Anyone who's visited this channel in the past will probably know what's coming next, but if you don't, you're likely thinking that there's at least a couple of games that I've not mentioned yet which deserve to be on this list, even with my carefully schemed exclusions. So before you start writing that comment, there is one more game that I'll explain away, which we've already kind of referred to. And this time I really am talking about Hollow Knight Silksong. Look, it's a Metroidvania, and I do wish I had a more valid excuse than that, but for me, I've just got entirely no interest in playing it, so I can't really give an assessment on it. I'm sure it's good, so look, here it is, special mention, gold star, but I can't put it on my top 10 list. So if you want to write that complaint now about Ball Pit or Clover Pit or Mega Bonk Pit, feel free, because yeah, they're not here either. Because finally, to the surprise of absolutely nobody who follows this channel, IndieLoupe's 2025 Game of the Year is Blueprints from Dokubomb. I've probably said enough about Blueprints in the past that I don't really want to punish anyone who's stuck with this list until the end. Surely no one just skipped ahead to this bit, right? But it is such an incredibly unique game, which I maintain is genre-defying and, yes, not a roguelike. I've never played anything quite like it before, and I doubt that anything will come along that'll be able to replicate it in the future. Innovation or uniqueness is not inherently good, however, and on paper, I think you could make a lot of arguments for why Blueprints should absolutely not work. For a lot of people, it doesn't. But man, if it does. I do have to admit that it's been a while since I've played it, because actively doing so pretty much swallows any free time that I might have. If I've got ambitions to watch something, or play literally any other game, or shower, then once I'm in that zone, those things come a pretty distant second to Blueprints. I'd be lying if I said listening to the game's excellent soundtrack by Dutch jazz electronica duo Trig and Gusset, or looking back through my, by some standards, relatively meagre 34 pages of notes, doesn't make me want to load it up again and dive right back into wherever I last left Mount Holly. Other games might have more well-crafted stories, flashier mechanics, cleaner endings, but the intrigue and depth here, real depth, not just the illusion of it, is incredible. Despite being about as up-to-date on all the game's spoilers as it's possible to be, I can't help but wonder how many secrets are still buried yet deeper within Mount Holly's walls, still waiting to be uncovered, not just by me, but by anyone. There's a frankly maddening spiral of deeper and deeper knowledge, with the only apparent end to that coming when the player finally accepts that they won't discover everything. And I can only forgive that arguably questionable design choice, as the game is a testament to what can be created when someone sets out with a clear vision of what their dream game looks like, and just makes it, without compromising, without trying to appeal to everyone. For me though, there was no question that it was going to be my Game of the Year, despite 2025 having such a strong showing. And I guess that's 2025. We'll see what next year brings, but I really think it's going to take some beating. Please do tell me in the comments what I've missed, because there'll definitely be some games out there. Feel free to tell me where I'm wrong, hell, you can even tell me where I'm right, if you like. I'd really love to hear other people's takes on their indie games of the year. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time in maybe 2026.